The rain came down like it meant something, not the soft kind that whispers against windows, but the Arizona monsoon kind that hammers sheet metal and turns gravel into rivers and makes a man question every decision that put him on a motorcycle in the middle of nowhere at 9:47 on a Thursday night. Jake Hunter pulled his Harley under the awning of Maple's Diner and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt wrong, like the space between thunder and lightning, where you're waiting for the world to crack open. He sat there for a moment, rain drumming the tin roof above him, and let the tension bleed out of his shoulders. 11 hours on the road. Flagstaff to Tucson and back again, delivering a package he hadn't asked about because asking meant knowing, and knowing meant being responsible for something other than the weight of it in his saddlebag. He swung off the bike, pulled his helmet free, ran a hand through hair that had gone more gray than black sometime in the last 5 years without him noticing. 42 years old, 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and the kind of weariness that doesn't come from miles traveled, but from carrying things you can't set down. The vest he wore was black leather worn soft at the shoulders, patches across the back that most people in Arizona recognize on sight. Hell's Angels, the Death Head, the Bottom Rocker. He'd been riding with the club for 17 years, long enough that the leather had shaped itself to his body like a second skin, long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to walk into a room and not watch it change. He pushed through the door. The bell above chimed once, bright and cheerful, completely unaware of the irony. The diner was small, maybe a dozen tables, a long counter with stools bolted to the floor, the kind of place that served coffee and pie and didn't ask questions because the tips were better that way. It smelled like fryer oil and rain-soaked upholstery and something sweet he couldn't place. The room shifted when he entered. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just the small, inevitable reorganization of space that happens when a man who looks like Jake Hunter walks into a place where everyone else is trying very hard to be unremarkable. A couple in the corner booth stopped mid-sentence. A teenage kid at the counter turned, saw the vest turned back so fast he nearly knocked over his Coke. The waitress behind the counter, heavy-set woman in her late 40s with reading glasses, pushed up into graying hair, looked up from her order pad, and went very still for exactly half a second before reaching for the coffee pot like she needed something to hold on to. Jake had stopped registering these reactions 15 years ago. They were background noise now. The price of the patch. The cost of choosing a family that the rest of the world had decided was dangerous. He took the stool at the far end of the counter away from everyone and set his helmet on the seat beside him. The waitress came over. Her name tag said Carol. She poured coffee without being asked, hands steady enough that he respected it. "Just coffee for now," he said, voice low, the kind of quiet that comes from years of knowing that volume doesn't equal authority. "And whatever pie you've got, apple or peach, apple." She nodded and left, and he wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat work its way through his palms. Outside, the rain kept doing what it was doing, and inside, the diner settled back into its rhythms, and Jake sat there and tried to remember the last time he'd felt like he belonged anywhere. It had been a long time. 15 years if he was counting. 15 years since he'd worn a different kind of uniform, carried a different kind of authority, believed that the system worked if you just worked hard enough within it. 15 years since he'd arrested a county commissioner's son for assault and watched his captain bury the case. 15 years since he'd refused to let it go and found himself on the wrong side of a department that valued loyalty over truth. He'd lost his badge, lost his marriage, lost his daughter who'd been 7 years old and who looked at him now like he was a stranger who'd stolen her father's face. The pie arrived. He ate in silence and tried not to think about Emily, about the way she'd asked him once, why he couldn't just let things be, why he always had to be the one to fix what was broken. He'd told her it was because someone had to. She'd told him that someone didn't have to be him. She'd been right. But by the time he'd understood that she was gone, and his daughter was calling another man, Dad and Jake was on a Harley heading toward people who understood that some things were worth fighting for even when you lost everything in the process. He was almost done with his pie when he felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, just the specific, unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone who had made a decision and was gathering the courage to act on it. He didn't turn right away. He lifted his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and waited. Let whoever it was come to him. He'd learned that patience was the only real power a man like him had left. The footsteps stopped behind him, close, maybe 2 feet. Then a voice, small and careful and trembling at the edges, but not at the center. "Excuse me." He turned. She was old. That was the first thing. 80-something, maybe older, with white hair pulled back in a bun that was coming loose at the edges and hands that were folded in front of her like a woman in prayer. She wore a cardigan over a floral dress, sensible shoes, and an expression that Jake recognized immediately because he'd worn it himself more times than he could count. Fear, the bone-deep kind. The kind that sits in your chest and makes it hard to breathe but doesn't stop you from moving because moving is the only option left. But her eyes were something else entirely. Sharp, clear, undefeated. The eyes of a woman who had lived through things that would have broken someone weaker and had decided that broken was not an option. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice was steady despite the trembling hands. "But I need your help." Jake looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the diner had gone quiet again. Not the shocked quiet of his entrance, a different kind. The held breath quiet of people who know something is happening and don't yet know if they should intervene. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think you might have me confused with someone else." "No." Firm. Immediate. "I don't." She pulled out the stool next to him and sat down, and the act of it, the sheer audacity of an 80-something-year-old woman sitting down next to a Hell's Angel without hesitation made something shift in Jake's chest. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," she said, "and I am going to ask you to do something that will sound insane, and I need you to say yes before I can explain why." Jake set his coffee mug down. "I'm listening. In about 30 seconds, a man is going to walk through that door. He's going to say he's my son. He's going to have documentation. He's going to be very calm and very convincing." She paused. "He's going to be lying. Why would he do that? Because I'm carrying something he wants, something worth killing for." Her hands tightened in her lap. "And he's already killed once to try to get it." Jake looked past her, scanning the room the way he'd learned to scan rooms when knowing who was where meant the difference between walking out or being carried out. Nothing obvious. Carol refilling water glasses. The couple in the corner. The kid with the Coke. 2 truckers by the window he hadn't noticed before. Then the door opened. The man who walked in was exactly what Eleanor had described, though she hadn't described him. Tall, mid-50s, dark suit expensive but not flashy, brown hair going gray at the temples, and a smile. Pleasant, easy, the kind of smile that people practice until it looks natural. He paused just inside the door, let his eyes move around the room like a man looking for someone specific, but trying not to make it obvious. His gaze found Eleanor. The smile didn't change. That was the thing Jake noticed. Most people, when they find who they're looking for, something moves through their face first. Relief, anger, recognition. This man's face didn't move at all. The smile just stayed exactly where it was. He came forward unhurried, smooth, like a man who had never once felt the need to rush because things had always resolved themselves in his favor. He stopped on Eleanor's other side, placed one hand on the counter, not touching her, not yet, but close. The specific kind of close that says I could. Eleanor. His voice was warm, concerned, the voice of a man playing a role he'd rehearsed. You had us all so worried. Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on her folded hands and said nothing. The man turned to Jake. I'm sorry if my mother disturbed you. She has a tendency to wander, especially when she's confused. He reached into his jacket, produced a wallet, slid out a business card with practiced ease. Martin Hale. I can assure you I'll take good care of her from here. Jake took the card, looked at it, set it on the counter without looking up. She's not confused, he said. A pause. Brief, almost imperceptible. Excuse me? She walked straight to me, sat down, spoke clearly, knew exactly what she was saying. Jake looked up, met Hale's eyes. That's not confused. The smile stayed in place. She has good days and bad days. I'm sure she seemed lucid, but she told me, Jake said, his voice flat and deliberate, that a man was going to walk in here and claim to be her son. She told me he'd have documentation. She told me he'd be lying. He tilted his head slightly. So, which part of that sounds confused to you? Something moved behind Martin Hale's eyes. Something that was not warmth and was not concern. Something calculating and cold and very, very patient. Sir Hale said, his voice dropping half a register, I understand you're trying to help, but this is a family matter, and it would be in everyone's best interest if I what? The question sat in the air between them. Hale looked at Jake, all 6'4" of him, the leather vest, the patches, the steady hands, the eyes that had seen enough of the world's worst corners that they'd stopped flinching. If you stayed out of it, Hale finished. Jake nodded slowly. See, here's the thing. Your mother, he put deliberate emphasis on the word, asked me for help. And I've got a policy about that. Someone asks for help. I don't walk away just because it's inconvenient. Eleanor's hand beneath the counter found the edge of Jake's stool, not grabbing it, just resting against it, like touching something solid. Hale straightened, adjusted his jacket. The smile didn't leave. It just became something that lived entirely on the surface of his face, connected to nothing underneath. All right, he said quietly. I can see you've made your decision, but I think you should know what you're involving yourself in. I'm listening. My mother is not well. She hasn't been well for some time. And the people who care about her, he paused. Let that word hang there. The people who actually care about her well-being, we're trying to get her the help she needs. What you're doing right now, however well-intentioned, is making that harder. Jake picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, set it down. Carol, he called out, not loud, just enough to carry. The waitress looked up. This gentleman says he's this lady's son. You know this lady? She been in here before? Carol looked between Jake and Hale. Her expression was careful. The expression of a woman caught between forces she didn't understand and didn't want to be part of. I've seen her in here a few times, Carol said slowly. She usually comes in with... She stopped, looked at Eleanor. Honey, are you all right? I'm fine, dear, Eleanor said, her voice perfectly composed. I'm having coffee with my friend here. Your friend Hale repeated. His tone suggested the word tasted bad. That's right, Jake said. He turned to Eleanor. What did you want to talk to me about again? Eleanor looked at him. Something passed between them. An understanding, a choice being made in real time. I wanted to talk to you about my husband, she said clearly. Thomas. He died 14 months ago. She paused. They said it was a heart attack, but it wasn't. The diner went absolutely silent. Hale's face did something then. The smile didn't disappear, but it stopped being a smile. The muscles held the shape, but the thing animating it withdrew, and what was left was just an arrangement of features signifying nothing. Eleanor, he said. Just her name. Quietly. In a tone that somehow managed to compress warning and promise and patience into 3 syllables. Don't use my name, Eleanor said, her voice sharp as a blade. You used it at Thomas's funeral, and I haven't been able to stand the sound of it in your mouth since. Something cold moved through the room. Not dramatic, not loud, just the specific atmospheric shift that happens when people realize they're witnessing something that matters. Jake kept his eyes on Hale, watched the man's face rearrange itself, watched calculation replace performance, watched the mask come off piece by piece until what was left was something harder and more honest and significantly more dangerous. Mr. Hale glanced at the patches on Jake's vest, decided not to finish that sentence. I'm going to step outside and make a phone call. When I come back, I hope we can resolve the situation in a way that doesn't require complications. He turned and walked toward the door, pushed through it, and was swallowed by the storm outside. The diner breathed. Everyone who'd been holding their breath let it out at once, and the room filled with the small sounds of people trying to pretend they hadn't just watched something unfold that they didn't fully understand. Jake turned to Eleanor. How long before he comes back? Not long. Her hand was still resting against his stool. He could feel the slight pressure of it. He'll make a call first, bring more people, and then they won't ask any more. They'll just take. Jake thought about that, about the specific phrasing. They'll just take. Not negotiate, not persuade. Take. The word choice of someone who'd been on the receiving end of that verb before. Tell me about your husband, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she unwrapped her hands and clasped them around the coffee mug Carol had placed in front of her at some point without either of them noticing. Thomas was a county auditor, she said, for 31 years. Quiet work, methodical work, the kind of work nobody notices unless something goes wrong. She paused. About 2 years before he died, something went wrong. Outside, through the rain-blurred window, a pair of headlights rolled slowly into the gravel parking lot and stopped. Then another pair, then a third. Jake kept his eyes on Eleanor. Keep going. He found discrepancies, she said. Small at first. Expenditures coded to projects that didn't exist. Transfers between accounts with names that sounded legitimate, but dissolved the moment you tried to trace them. Her voice stayed level. Precise. The voice of a woman repeating something she'd heard so many times she could recite it in her sleep. He spent 8 months verifying before he told me a single thing. Because Thomas believed that accuracy was a form of respect. What did he find? $14 million, Eleanor said. Over 6 years. Moved in pieces small enough to avoid automatic flags. Contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper. Grants approved for projects that were never built. She looked at the surface of her coffee. The money ended up in 3 places, 3 people. Two of them are names most people in this state would recognize. The third is a man who holds a position that makes him very difficult to touch even with evidence. Jake processed that. 14 million. 3 people. 2 politicians if he was reading between the lines correctly, and a third with institutional protection. "Where's the evidence now?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "With me." He didn't react, didn't let anything change in his expression. But internally, everything rearranged itself because that one answer transformed this from a frightened old woman fleeing bad people into something significantly more dangerous. She wasn't running because she knew something. She was running because she was carrying it. What form, he asked. A drive. And printed copies. Thomas made 3 sets of everything. He always said a single point of failure was the same as no backup at all. For the first time, something almost like a smile crossed her face. He was a very thorough man. "Where are the other 2 sets?" "I mailed one to my attorney in Phoenix 3 days ago. Paul Henley. I don't know if it arrived safely. I haven't been able to reach him." The almost smile disappeared. "The other was at our home in Scottsdale. I left before I could retrieve it. I don't know if they've found it." Jake absorbed that. 3 copies. 1 mailed, 1 possibly compromised, and 1 sitting in this diner in the purse or pocket of an 89-year-old woman who'd been running for God knows how long. "So what you're carrying right now," he said slowly, "may be the only copy that still exists intact." "Yes." She met his eyes. "Which is why I need to get it to someone who can do something with it. A federal agent, a prosecutor, someone outside the county system." She exhaled. "I've been trying to get to Flagstaff for 2 days. Every time I stop somewhere with Wi-Fi to make contact, I look up and there they are again." 2 days. This woman had been running for 2 days. Alone. At 89 years old. Staying 1 step ahead of men in black SUVs with nothing but the evidence her dead husband had spent 8 months compiling. And she'd walked into this diner, looked around at every available option, and chosen him. "Why me?" Jake asked. He needed to hear it. She didn't hesitate. "Because everyone else in this room is hoping the problem goes away on its own. You're the only person here who looks like you've ever had to face something head-on and deal with the consequences." She paused. "I could see it the moment you walked in. The way you carry yourself. You're not afraid of consequences. Most people are. That's why they look away." Before Jake could respond, the diner door opened again. Not Martin Hale this time. 2 men, both younger, mid-30s, both wearing jackets over button-down shirts, business casual in the deliberately vague way that could pass as almost anything. One was stocky, built like someone who'd played football in high school and kept the weight on through sheer momentum. The other was leaner, with a stillness about him that Jake recognized immediately as trained. They took a table near the door. Not the counter, a table, where both of them had sight lines to the entire room. "Don't turn around," Jake said quietly to Eleanor. "I know," she said. "They're young. They're trying to look casual. They're not. How many?" 2 inside now. 3 vehicles outside." She was still looking at her coffee. "He does this. They wait until they have enough people, and then they don't ask anymore." Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. A text from Danny Reyes, one of his brothers from the club. "You good?" Jake had told Danny he'd be passing through, might stop for coffee. Danny had offered to ride back up. Jake had said no, it was just coffee, he'd be fine. He texted back, "Need you. Maple's Diner, Route 89. Bring 2 more. Quiet." The reply came back in seconds. 20 minutes. Jake put the phone away, looked at Eleanor. "I've got people coming, but we need to buy time." "How much time?" 20 minutes. She nodded once. No panic. No questions about who his people were or why they'd drop everything to ride out into a storm on his word alone. Just acceptance. The acceptance of a woman who understood that sometimes you had to trust people you didn't know because the alternative was trusting people you knew would hurt you. Carol came over with the coffee pot hands shakier now than they'd been when Jake first arrived. She refilled his mug without making eye contact. "Carol," Jake said quietly. She looked up. "Those 2 men who just came in. You know them." She glanced toward the table by the door. Swallowed. "Never seen them before. They say anything to you?" "Not yet." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But one of them keeps looking over here." Jake nodded. "Do me a favor. In about 15 minutes, I'm going to need you to do something for me. Something that might seem strange." "What kind of something?" "The kind that keeps this woman safe," Jake said, gesturing to Eleanor. "The kind that might cost you some trouble later, but the kind that's the right thing to do right now." Carol looked at Eleanor, really looked at her. At the trembling hands and the steady eyes and the cardigan that had seen better days, and the quiet dignity of a woman who'd been through something terrible and was still here, still fighting. Something moved through Carol's expression, some decision being made in real time. "What do you need?" she asked. Before Jake could answer, his phone buzzed again. Not Danny this time. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hunter." A woman's voice. Professional. Clipped. "This is Agent Diane Mercer, FBI, Phoenix Field Office. I received a message from a Marshal Ray Calder that you might be in a situation requiring federal assistance. Is that accurate?" Jake blinked. Ray. He hadn't talked to Ray in 3 years, not since Ray had retired and moved out to Camp Verde to raise horses and pretend he didn't miss the work. But Ray had contacts everywhere, and if someone had reached out to Ray about Eleanor Mitchell, then someone had been trying to help her for longer than just tonight. "It's accurate," Jake said. "Can you speak freely?" "Not entirely." "Understood. I need you to answer yes or no. Are you with Eleanor Mitchell right now?" "Yes." "Is she safe?" "For the moment." "Are there hostile parties present?" "Yes." A pause on the other end. "Then I'm sending a unit to your location. ETA 35 minutes. Can you hold that long?" Jake looked at the 2 men by the door, looked at the 3 vehicles outside, did the math. "We'll find out," he said. "Mr. Hunter, I need you to understand something. If Eleanor Mitchell is carrying what we believe she's carrying, then the people looking for her are not going to stop, and they are not going to negotiate. Your best option is to get her out of that location and to a secure area where we can facilitate a transfer. Working on it. Call this number if the situation deteriorates. We have assets in the area." The line went dead. Jake looked at Eleanor. "FBI's coming. 35 minutes. That's longer than we have," Eleanor said. "I know." The door opened again. Martin Hale walked back in, and this time everything about him was different. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but Jake noticed. The smile was gone. The performance was over. What walked through that door was something harder and more honest and significantly more dangerous than what had walked out. Hale came straight to the counter. Didn't sit. Just stood there looking down at Eleanor with an expression that was very calm and very final. "Last chance," he said quietly. Come with me now, and this ends quietly. Everyone walks away. No one gets hurt. Eleanor looked up at him. My husband tried to do the right thing. It killed him. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by doing anything less. Hale's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. The only mistake, Eleanor said, her voice steady as stone, was trusting people like you. Hale looked at Jake. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. Probably not, Jake said. But I'm involved now, so either you leave or we wait here together until the people I called show up. Your choice. For a moment, Hale didn't move, just stood there doing calculations behind his eyes. Then he reached into his jacket. Jake's hand went to his belt, not fast, not aggressive, just ready. Hale pulled out his phone, held it up. I'm going to make a call. And then this situation is going to resolve itself one way or another. He turned and walked back outside. Eleanor's hand found Jake's, squeezed once. Her palm was cold. Thank you, she said quietly. Jake looked at this woman who'd been running for 2 days, who'd lost her husband to corruption and greed, who'd walked toward him in a room full of people who'd looked away, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked down for 15 years. Since Emily, since the badge, since the last time he'd believed that doing the right thing mattered. Don't thank me yet, he said. We're not out of this. Outside engine started, not leaving, just running, ready. And somewhere in the Arizona night, 3 motorcycles were cutting through the rain headed this way because Jake Hunter had made a call and his brothers were coming. Because that's what family did. Danny Reyes arrived 18 minutes later with 2 riders Jake recognized immediately. Cruz, who never spoke and never needed to, and a younger member named Finn, who'd been prospecting for 6 months and rode like he had something to prove. They pulled into the parking lot with their lights off, engines low, the deliberate quiet of men who understood that loud was sometimes the opposite of effective. Jake watched them through the window. Watched Danny take in the 3 SUVs, the positioning the 2 men visible inside the diner. Watched him process it all in the space of maybe 5 seconds before his hand went up in a signal Jake knew by heart. We see it. What do you need? Jake pulled out his phone, texted back. Back exit. Service road. Be ready. The reply came instantly. Copy. Eleanor was watching him with those sharp, steady eyes. Your people. Yeah. They're willing to do this for someone they don't know. Jake looked at her. They're willing to do this because I asked. That's how it works. She absorbed that, nodded once. Thomas used to talk about men like you, men who kept their word even when it cost them something. He said they were rare. He was right. The 2 men by the door were watching them now, not even pretending otherwise. One of them had his phone out typing something. The other just stared flat and patient the way people stare when they're waiting for permission to stop being patient. Carol appeared at Jake's elbow, coffee pot in hand, even though his mug was still full. Her voice was barely audible. There's a kitchen door, goes out to the back. Service road runs along there. She paused. My car's parked on that road. Keys are in it. Jake looked at her. You're sure no? She met his eyes. But I'm doing it anyway. Why? Carol glanced at Eleanor, then back to Jake. Because my husband's a cop. Because he's told me things about how the system works that make me sick. And because if I look the other way right now, I won't be able to live with myself tomorrow. She walked away before Jake could respond. Eleanor had heard every word. She's risking her job, maybe more. I know. People keep doing that tonight. For me, a stranger. Jake turned to face her fully. "You're not a stranger. You're someone who needs help. That's all that matters." Before Eleanor could respond, Jake's phone buzzed again. "Agent Mercer. Hunter. What's your status?" "Still holding." "How far out are you?" 28 minutes. "But I need to tell you something before you make your next move." A pause. "We reached Paul Henley's office in Phoenix." Something in her tone made Jake's stomach tighten. "And Mr. Henley was in a car accident 2 weeks ago. He's been in a rehabilitation facility since. His office was broken into sometime in the last 72 hours. The documents Eleanor sent him are gone." The words hit like a physical thing. Jake looked at Eleanor, who was watching his face, reading the change in it. "Say that again," Jake said. "The attorney's copies are gone, which means what Eleanor's carrying is the only set left." "Yes." Eleanor's eyes went wide. Not panic. Worse. The specific horror of understanding something that had been true all along but hidden from you. Her hand went to her chest, pressed there like she was trying to hold something inside. "Does she know?" Mercer asked. "She does now." A pause. "Get her out of there, Mr. Hunter. Whatever it takes." The line went dead. Jake turned to Eleanor. She was staring at nothing, her lips moving slightly, like she was doing math in her head. The math of how many times she'd thought she had backup, how many times she'd told herself that if something happened to her, at least the evidence would survive through Henley. How many times that thought had been the only thing keeping her moving forward. "Thomas always made 3 copies," she said quietly. "Always. He said redundancy was the only protection that mattered." Her voice cracked just slightly, just for a second. "I thought I had backup." "You did," Jake said. "You have me. You have my brothers outside. You have an FBI agent 28 minutes away. That's your backup now." She looked at him. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." "If it does," she continued, her voice firmer, "now the drive is in my left shoe. Inside the soul. Thomas taught me that. He said the most overlooked places are always the most ordinary ones." Jake nodded. "Smart man. The smartest I ever knew." She paused. "That's why they killed him." The diner door opened. Not Hale this time. A woman. Late 50s, well-dressed in the careful way that suggests money without advertising it. She walked straight to the 2 men by the door, spoke to them briefly, then turned and looked directly at Eleanor. Something about her was different from Hale. Hale had been performance and calculation. This woman was pure calculation, no performance at all. Just the cold, practical assessment of someone evaluating a problem and determining the most efficient solution. She came to the counter, stood where Hale had stood, looked at Eleanor the way you'd look at a spreadsheet. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said. Her voice was pleasant, professional, the voice of someone conducting business. "My name is Patricia Webb. I represent certain interests that would very much like to resolve this situation amicably." "I'm not interested in resolution," Eleanor said. "I think you should hear what I have to say first." "I don't think I should." Patricia Webb smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with maintaining the appearance of civility. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for its return." "It belongs to my husband," Eleanor said. "And to the people whose tax money was stolen. I'm not interested in selling it back to the thieves." Webb's smile didn't change. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're upset. Your husband's death was tragic, but holding on to this information won't bring him back. It will only put you and your family in danger." Eleanor went very still. My family, your son in Portland, your granddaughter Sarah. 16, isn't she lovely girl? Would be a shame if something happened to her because you refused to be reasonable. Jake moved before he thought about it. Not threatening, just a shift in position that put him slightly between Webb and Eleanor. A reminder that Eleanor wasn't alone. Webb noticed, assessed him the same way she'd assessed Eleanor, dismissed him just as quickly. "This doesn't concern you," she said. "You just threatened a 16-year-old girl," Jake said quietly. "That concerns me. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply pointed out a reality. The world is dangerous. Accidents happen, especially to people connected to those who make poor choices." Eleanor's breathing had changed. Short, rapid, the beginning of panic. Jake put his hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Breathe," he said quietly. "She can't touch Sarah. She's in Portland. With your son. She's safe." "You don't know that," Eleanor whispered. "I do, because threats like that are about fear, not capability. If they could get to Sarah, they wouldn't warn you about it. They'd just do it." Webb's smile finally disappeared. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "Good," Jake said. Webb reached into her purse. Jake's hand went to his belt again. She pulled out a phone, held it up so Eleanor could see the screen. It was a photo. A teenage girl with dark hair and Eleanor's eyes wearing a school uniform standing outside a building that looked like it could be a high school. Recent. Maybe taken yesterday. Eleanor made a sound. Small. Broken. The sound of a woman's worst fear confirming itself. "Sarah's fine," Webb said calmly. "And she'll stay fine, as long as you make the right choice." Jake looked at the photo, looked at Webb, felt something cold and final settle into his chest. "Carol," he called out, "call the police. Tell them there's a woman in here threatening a child." Carol picked up the phone behind the counter. Her hands were shaking, but she was dialing. Webb laughed. Actually laughed. "The police? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "Yeah," Jake said. "I've got a pretty good idea. You're someone who thinks money and connections make you untouchable. Someone who's never had to face consequences because you've always been able to pay someone else to face them for you." He leaned forward slightly. "But right now, in this diner, you're just someone threatening a kid. And that makes you the kind of person I have no problem putting through a wall." Webb's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A recalculation. She looked at the two men by the door. Some signal passed between them. Then she looked back at Eleanor. "You have until midnight. After that, I can't guarantee your family's safety." She turned and walked out. The diner was silent for exactly 5 seconds. Then Eleanor started crying. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who'd been holding it together for so long that the effort of it had finally become too much. Jake pulled out his phone, called Danny. "Yeah, the woman who just walked out. Follow her. Don't engage. Just see where she goes." "Copy." He hung up. Called a different number. It rang 4 times before a man answered, voice thick with sleep. "This better be important. Ray, it's Jake. I need a favor." Ray Calder was silent for a moment. Then, "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves protecting a 16-year-old girl in Portland who's just been threatened by people connected to a $14 million corruption case." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Give me the details." Jake gave him everything. Sarah's name, Robert Mitchell's name, the school in the photo, everything Eleanor had told him. Ray listened without interrupting, the way he always had, the way Jake remembered from their time working together before everything fell apart. "I know someone in Portland PD," Ray said finally. "Good cop. Actually gives a damn. I'll make the call. Get a patrol car on the girl until this is resolved. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If these people are as connected as you're saying, a patrol car might not be enough. It's more than she has right now." Ray was quiet for a beat. Then Jake, "What are you into?" "The right thing," Jake said. "For once." "That's what I was afraid of." A pause. "Be careful. The right thing has a way of getting people killed." "I know." He hung up. Looked at Eleanor, who'd gotten herself back under control, wiping at her eyes with a napkin Carol had silently provided. "Sarah's going to have police protection within the hour," Jake said. "Ray's the best. If he says he'll handle it, it's handled." Eleanor nodded. Couldn't speak yet. Just nodded. Jake's phone buzzed. Mercer again. "I just got a call from Portland PD. Someone requested protection for Sarah Mitchell. Was that you, friend of mine?" "Good call. I'm coordinating with them now. The girl will be safe." A pause. "Hunter, we've got a problem. I just received intel that Warren Goss himself is en route to your location." Jake felt his blood go cold. "The chief deputy." "Yes, which means this has escalated beyond what I initially assessed. Goss doesn't personally involve himself in operations unless the stakes are catastrophic." Another pause. "You need to get Eleanor out of there now. Not in 20 minutes. Now. Copy that." He looked at Eleanor. Time to move. She stood without hesitation. Whatever fear she'd felt was buried now, pushed down beneath that extraordinary will. She picked up her purse, straightened her cardigan, and looked at him with those steady eyes. "Where are we going?" "Out the back. My people are waiting." They moved toward the kitchen. Carol intercepted them halfway, pressed her car keys into Jake's hand. "Blue Civic, Service Road. Go." Carol, "Go," she said firmly. "I'll handle whatever comes next." Jake wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't have to do this, but there wasn't time, and Carol's expression said she'd already made her choice and wasn't interested in being talked out of it. They pushed through the kitchen door. The young cook looked up, saw them, started to say something, then apparently decided that whatever was happening was above his pay grade and went back to the grill. The back door had a push bar. Jake hit it with his shoulder, and they were outside, rain hitting them immediately, cold and hard. The Civic was exactly where Carol said it would be. Danny was standing next to it, soaked through, helmet in hand. Cruz and Finn are circling the block. Hale's people are watching the front. Nobody's on this road yet. Yet Jake repeated, "Yeah." Danny looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am," young man Eleanor said, inclining her head slightly, somehow maintaining dignity despite being drenched and terrified. Danny almost smiled. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Jake got Eleanor into the passenger seat, closed the door, turned to Danny. "I need you to do something for me. Name it. Go back to the chapter house. Get Marcus. Tell him I need him to contact every friendly badge he knows and start making noise about Warren Goss. Nothing official. Just questions. Enough to make Goss know that people are paying attention. You think that'll slow him down? I think it might make him think twice about doing something stupid in public." Danny nodded. "Consider it done." He was on his bike and gone before Jake could say anything else. Jake got into the Civic, started the engine. Eleanor was sitting very still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. "Your granddaughter's going to be fine," Jake said. "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise that Ray Calder doesn't make promises he can't keep." And he promised. She nodded, still didn't look at him. Thomas used to say that the hardest part of doing the right thing wasn't the doing. It was watching the people you love pay the price for it. Jake pulled onto the service road, lights off, moving slow. He was right. He usually was. She finally turned to look at him. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jake thought about that. Thought about Emily asking him the same question 15 years ago. Why do you have to be the one to fix what's broken? Thought about his daughter who barely spoke to him anymore because he'd chosen principle over family. Because he said, finally, I spent 15 years being the guy who walked away, and it cost me everything. So now when someone asks for help, I don't walk away, even if it costs me something, especially if it does. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, your wife left you. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Because you tried to do the right thing. Yeah. And you're still trying. Jake pulled onto the highway, heading east away from the diner, away from Hale and Webb and whatever else was coming. I don't know how to do anything else. Eleanor reached over and put her hand on his arm. Just rested it there. An old woman's hand, wrinkled and spotted and trembling slightly but steady in its intent. Thomas would have liked you, she said. And Jake, who hadn't cried in 15 years, felt something hot and sharp behind his eyes. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before his phone rang. Mercer, where are you? Route 89 heading toward Camp Verde. Good. I've arranged for a secure location. Ray Calder's property. He's expecting you. A pause. Hunter, I need to tell you something else. We've been monitoring communications. Goss made a call 20 minutes ago to a Senator Williams. Do you know that name? Jake glanced at Eleanor. Her face had gone white. Mrs. Mitchell knows it, he said. Eleanor's voice was barely audible. David Williams. He and Thomas were friends. College roommates. He came to our wedding. Mrs. Mitchell Mercer said, her voice gentle but firm. Senator Williams is one of the 3 names on your husband's list. Eleanor made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, something in between. The sound of a betrayal so complete that it doesn't have a proper vocabulary. He spoke at Thomas's funeral, she whispered. He told me Thomas was the most honest man he'd ever known. A pause. He looked me in the eye and said that. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. Mercer, how deep does this go? Deeper than we initially thought. Williams has been making calls for the last hour, to judges, to county officials, to media contacts. He's building a narrative that Eleanor is mentally unstable, that the documents are fabrications, that this is a tragic case of a widow who can't accept her husband's death. Can he make that stick if he gets ahead of the evidence? Yes. Which is why I need those files tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. We're 20 minutes from Ray's place. I'll have agents there waiting. We'll do the transfer immediately. A pause. Mrs. Mitchell, if you're listening, I need you to understand something. The people you're up against, they're not just corrupt, they're organized. They have resources, they have relationships, and they will use every single advantage they have to discredit you and bury this evidence. Your husband knew that. That's why he was so careful. That's why he made 3 copies. Eleanor's voice was steadier now, harder. Then, let's make sure his care wasn't for nothing. Yes, ma'am. The call ended. Jake looked at Eleanor. You okay? No, she said simply. But I will be. After this is done. After they're held accountable. She paused. David Williams looked me in the eye at my husband's funeral and lied to me. I'm going to look him in the eye in a courtroom and tell the truth, and then we'll see which one of us the jury believes. Jake almost smiled. Remind me never to piss you off. Too late for that, young man. You've already involved yourself in my mess. I'm very pissed off that you felt you had to. This time he did smile. Fair enough. They were 15 minutes from Ray's property when Danny called. Jake, we got a problem. Talk to me. That woman who came into the diner, Patricia Webb. We followed her like you said. She went straight to a private airfield outside Scottsdale. There was a jet waiting. She's gone. Gone where we don't know. But here's the thing. Right before she got on the plane, a car pulled up. Black sedan, county plates. A man got out. They talked for maybe 2 minutes. Then she left. What did the man look like? Mid-60s. Gray hair, wearing a sheriff's department jacket. Warren Goss. It had to be. Did you get a plate on the sedan? Better. I got a photo. Sending it now. Jake's phone buzzed. He pulled over, looked at the image. A man in profile, gray hair, strong jaw, the particular bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in uniform. And behind him, just visible through the car window, a badge. Chief Deputy Warren Goss. Jake forwarded the photo to Mercer, then pulled back onto the road. That's evidence, Eleanor said. That he met with her. That they're working together. It's circumstantial. They could claim it was coincidental. Nothing about this is coincidental. She looked out the window at the dark highway. Thomas knew that. He knew they'd claim coincidence, claim misunderstanding, claim anything except the truth. That's why he documented everything, every meeting, every transfer, every lie. Her voice broke slightly, and they killed him for it anyway. Jake didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. Thomas had done everything right, and it had gotten him killed. And now Eleanor was finishing what he'd started, and there was every chance it would get her killed too. But she was doing it anyway, because some things were worth dying for. The ranch property was dark when they arrived, but not empty. Jake could feel that before he saw it, the particular quality of a place where someone has been waiting. The way presence changes the air even when you can't see the person yet. He pulled the truck up to where the gravel widened and cut the engine. And for a moment, both of them just sat in the sudden silence, listening to the rain work itself down through a night that had started to feel at last like it might have an end to it. A light came on inside the structure ahead, not overhead, something lower, a lamp, the kind of light that says, "I'm here, but I'm not announcing it." "Stay close," Jake said, and he got out first. The man who opened the door was Ray Calder, 61 years old, former U.S. Marshal, retired under circumstances that had made some people in the federal system quietly grateful and others quietly nervous, depending on which side of a particular operation they had been standing on. He was shorter than Jake by 4 inches and broader through the shoulders than anyone his age had a right to be. With gray hair cut close and the specific kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the compression of a great deal of energy into a very small and deliberately controlled space. He looked at Jake. He looked at Eleanor. He stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." Eleanor walked past him without hesitating. Jake noticed that she'd been making that same choice all night. The choice to move forward into uncertain spaces rather than wait at the threshold, and it still struck him each time. Ray noticed it too. Jake could see it happen in the fraction of a second before Ray's expression settled back into its default neutrality. Inside, it was warm. Someone had left the heat running. There was a card table set up with 3 chairs, and on the table a laptop, a legal pad, a pen, and 2 phones, one raised, one a burner still in the packaging. "Sit down," Ray said. He was already moving to the table. "Both of you." They sat. Ray remained standing the way he always had in every room Jake had ever shared with him, positioned slightly to the side, sightline to the door, never quite fully at rest. "I reached out to someone," Ray said. "Her name is Diane Mercer, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, FBI Phoenix Field Office. I've known her for 16 years. She is not compromised. I would stake a significant amount on that." "How significant?" Jake asked. "My life, which I've done before, so the offer carries some weight." He looked at Evelyn. "She wants to speak with you directly tonight before any material is transferred." Eleanor's hands were on the table folded. She hadn't taken off Danny's jacket that someone had draped over her shoulders at some point. "That's reasonable," she said. "She'll want to verify the chain of custody on the evidence. She'll want to know how it was collected, who had access, and what Thomas's methodology was." "Thomas's methodology was impeccable," Eleanor said. "There was no defensiveness in it, just precision. He was a county auditor for 31 years. Documentation was his first language." Ray looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, like a man who had walked into a situation expecting one thing and found another. "All right, the call is set for 20 minutes from now. That gives you time to—" He gestured vaguely at the room, at the general condition of 2 people who had been running through a storm for the better part of an evening. Eleanor stood, straightened the jacket over her shoulders like she was adjusting a blazer before a board meeting. "I don't need 20 minutes, she said. "I've been preparing for this conversation for 14 months. Ray blinked. Then he looked at Jake with an expression that said very clearly, without words, "Where did you find this woman?" Jake said, "Nothing. Just pulled out his chair and sat back." Ray made the call at 11:22. Diane Mercer picked up on the second ring, which told Jake everything about how seriously Ray had communicated the situation. Senior federal law enforcement does not pick up on the second ring at 11:20 at night for a routine matter. She picked up because she'd been waiting for it. Her voice came through the phone speaker, measured and clear. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Agent Mercer. I've been briefed on the outline of your situation. Before we go further, I need to ask you some questions. Some of them may feel intrusive. I need you to understand that the intrusiveness is necessary." "I understand," Eleanor said. What followed was 22 minutes of the most methodical, precise, and completely unsentimental interview Jake had ever witnessed. Mercer asked about Thomas's employment history, his specific role and access within the county auditor's office, the timeline of when he'd first noticed the discrepancies, who he'd spoken to, and in what order, how the documentation had been created and stored, and exactly when and how Eleanor had come to be in possession of the primary drive. She asked about the woman in Prescott who died 3 weeks ago. She asked about Robert's phone call. She asked about Martin Hale by name. And there was a pause before she said that name, a short, controlled pause that told Jake that Hale was not unknown to Diane Mercer. Eleanor answered everything completely, without hesitation, without embellishment, without a single unnecessary word. She laid it out the way Thomas must have laid things out, in sequence, with precision, with the confidence of a woman who had been listening to a thorough man for 6 decades and had absorbed his method the way you absorb someone's accent when you've lived inside it long enough. When she finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Mercer said, "Mrs. Mitchell, the name you haven't said yet, the third name, the one your husband traced the money to beyond the politician and the developer." A pause. "I need that name." Eleanor looked at Jake. He kept his face still. This was her call to make. She looked at the phone. "His name is Warren Goss," she said. "He's the current chief deputy of the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office." The silence this time lasted longer. Ray, who had been standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man who had heard many things and registered few of them, visibly uncrossed his arms. Slowly, like a man whose body had responded before his mind gave it permission. "Say that again," Mercer said. "Warren Goss," Eleanor repeated. Thomas had 11 months of documentation on him specifically. Account transfers, contract approval chains, communications. Thomas believed Goss was not only a recipient, but the architect. The politician and the developer were beneficiaries. Goss was the mechanism. Jake heard Ray exhale through his nose quietly, almost inaudible. Warren Goss, chief deputy of a county sheriff's office. The man who supervised law enforcement, who had access to information about ongoing investigations, who could direct resources and attention toward or away from whatever he chose. Mrs. Mitchell Mercer said her voice was controlled, but something had changed in the quality of it. A kind of concentrated weight that wasn't there before. "I need you to understand what you've just said and what it means for the next steps." "It means," Eleanor said quietly, "that we can't use any law enforcement channel in this county or possibly in this state, depending on who Goss has relationships with." "That is correct." Thomas understood that. He was trying to reach a federal contact when he died. A pause. "He didn't make it in time. He made it eventually," Mercer said. And there was something in her voice then. Not sentiment, not performance, but something genuine and precise and quietly furious. "He made it through you." Eleanor looked down at the table for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back up. "What do you need from me?" "The drive scanned copies transmitted securely to my office tonight. I want the originals in my hands within 48 hours, and I want you in a secure location until I can arrange a formal protective detail that bypasses the county system entirely." A pause. "Can Mr. Hunter facilitate that?" Jake leaned toward the phone. "I can." "Good." Another pause. "There's one more thing, and I need to ask it now before we go any further." She hesitated, the first hesitation in the entire call. "Mrs. Mitchell, the name Martin Hale. When you said it to Ray, he passed it along to me. I pulled what I could in the last 20 minutes. A pause that felt like the space before something falls. Martin Hale is not private security. He is an attorney. He has a practice in Scottsdale that is legitimate on paper, but his firm represents clients that are connected 2 removes to Warren Goss's private financial interests." She stopped. "Let that breathe. What I'm telling you is that this is not just a few bad actors protecting stolen money. This has organizational depth. There are layers." Ray said from the wall. "How many layers?" Mercer said. "At least 2 above Goss." The room absorbed that. Jake had known on some level from the moment Eleanor said 2 names you'd recognize. He'd known when Hale walked in with 3 vehicles already in position. He'd known when the east side of the service road got covered faster than it should have. But knowing a thing in pieces and hearing it said plainly are 2 different experiences. And this one landed differently, heavier, more specific, with the particular gravity of something that has a shape now and can't be put back into abstraction. "Above Goss," Eleanor said slowly. Thomas suspected that. He didn't have documentation for it. He said the money trail went cold at Goss because Goss was very good at being the last traceable layer. He may have been right, Mercer said. But what you're carrying is enough for Goss, and Goss will give us the layers above him because that's what men like Goss do when the walls come in. They trade. Her voice had gone hard in the way of someone who has done this before and is not precious about the mechanics of it. Let me worry about the structure right now. I need the files. Ray opened the laptop. He talked Eleanor through the secure transmission process, an encrypted portal, a file key. Mercer texted to the burner phone the specific sequence for uploading without creating a traceable origin or endpoint. Eleanor handed over the drive with both hands, like a person setting down something that has been enormously heavy, and Ray began the upload. 4 minutes into the upload, Jake's phone buzzed. Danny, a single line. They're moving all 3 vehicles heading east on 89. Jake read it twice, put the phone face down on the table, looked at Ray without saying anything. Ray read the expression and straightened. How far out? Ray said quietly. They're on 89 heading east. If they know about this property. They don't, Ray said. It's not connected to me. You sure? A pause. Just a half second. I'm sure. You hesitated. I was thinking. Ray moved to the window, didn't open it, just positioned himself where he could listen to the outside. My brother David. We've been estranged for 3 years. He knows about this property, but he doesn't know about my work, and he has no connection to any of this. Could his phone be monitored? Ray turned from the window. His jaw was set. I called him from the burner. You used the burner before you opened it, Jake said. I saw you take it out of the packaging when we came in. Ray went still. I called David from my personal cell. Before you arrived, before I opened the burner. He stopped. The sequence ran through his expression like a current. I used my personal phone. David's number. I told him we'd be using the property tonight. The upload was at 63%. How long, Jake said to Ray, but he was already looking at the screen. 8 minutes, maybe 7. 7 minutes. Whoever was in those vehicles on Route 89, if they'd been on David's phone, if they'd had a flag on Ray's number, if they'd moved the moment that call was made, had potentially had an hour's head start in identifying this location. 7 minutes might be exactly what they had, or it might already be less. Jake stood. Mercer. He spoke toward the phone. The upload is in progress. We may have a situation developing at this location. How quickly can you have federal presence here? Mercer didn't miss a beat. Give me the coordinates and keep that upload running. Her voice had changed again. Tighter, faster, the shift of someone who has moved from investigation mode into operational mode without breaking stride. Don't let that upload stop for any reason. Ray gave her the coordinates. She was already talking to someone else in the background, her voice dropping out of the phone's range for a moment. Evelyn had been sitting perfectly still through all of it, watching each person in the room with those eyes that missed nothing. Now she said very quietly to Jake, "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. She was tired, genuinely tired. He could see it now in the set of her shoulders and the fine lines around her eyes that the adrenaline had been holding at bay for hours. But the eyes themselves were the same, undefeated. "Stay at this table," he said. "Don't move away from the laptop." He looked at Ray. "I'm going outside. Jake, if they're coming, I'd rather know before they're at the door." He was already moving. "Keep the upload running." He went out the way they'd come, in pulling the door almost closed behind him enough to keep the light inside. He stood in the wet dark and listened. The rain had dropped to a lighter pattern, the worst of the storm moving east, and the night was quieter than it had been at Maples. He could hear his own heartbeat in the drip from the eaves, and faintly the settling sound of the truck's engine cooling. Nothing else. He stood for 90 seconds, long enough to be sure he wasn't hearing the low vibration of approaching vehicles. Then he moved around the perimeter of the structure, not because he thought anyone was already there, but because standing still in a situation like this one was the thing you did when you'd run out of discipline, and discipline was the only thing that had gotten them this far. He'd made it around 3/4 of the building when his phone buzzed again. He looked at it. Danny, not a text this time. A call. He picked up immediately. "What, the vehicle stopped," Danny said. "All three about 1.5 miles back on 89. They're not moving." "How long?" "About 4 minutes now. They just stopped. Parked on the shoulder." Jake processed that. Parked on the shoulder, not moving, not advancing, not retreating. Are they communicating? Can you tell? "We were back about 1/4 mile on a parallel road. I can see the vehicles, but I can't see inside them." A pause. "Jake, there's something else." "Say it." About 5 minutes before they stopped, another vehicle joined them, coming from the opposite direction. It pulled up, sat for maybe 90 seconds, then left again, going west. "What kind of vehicle?" "Black sedan." "Different from the SUVs, smaller." Jake stood in the dark outside the ranch building and felt something sharpen in him. The specific alertness that arrives when a situation reveals a dimension you hadn't accounted for. A vehicle from the opposite direction. Someone coming to meet them on the road, delivering something. Information, instructions, a decision, and then leaving again. Someone who wasn't Martin Hale. Someone above Martin Hale. "The sedan," Jake said. "Did you get anything on it?" "Partial plate. Arizona. Runs come back to a fleet registration." "Fleet for what?" A pause. "Yavapai County." There it was. Warren Goss himself or one of his people had driven out to personally redirect the operation, had pulled up to those 3 vehicles on the shoulder of Road 89, delivered new information or new orders, and turned around and gone back west, back toward the county, back toward the position of a man who was never going to appear at a roadside confrontation because men like Warren Goss never got that close to their own work. But the vehicles had stopped, which meant whatever Goss had delivered, whatever he'd said in those 90 seconds on the shoulder of a highway in the rain, had resulted in a pause. Not a retreat, a pause. The kind that happens when someone decides to wait for a better moment, rather than commit to a move that might fail. Danny, Jake said, "Don't take your eyes off them. I'm not going anywhere." He went back inside. The upload was at 91%. Ray was on his phone in the corner, speaking in low, rapid sentences to someone Jake couldn't identify. Eleanor was at the table, hands folded, eyes on the screen, watching the progress bar with the focused patience of a woman who had spent her professional life helping people find things they needed and understood that the last 10% always took the longest. "They've stopped," Jake said. Ray looked up. "Stopped where?" 1.5 miles back on 89. Something redirected them. He paused. "Goss sent someone. Sedan from county plates met them on the road, left after 90 seconds. Ray's expression did the thing it did, went through something and came out the other side without showing what happened in between. He pulled them back or redirected them. Why would he pull back now?" "They know the approximate area." Because Jake said, slowly working it out as he said it, "The upload is almost done. And if Goss has anyone watching federal communications even loosely, he may know that Mercer's office made contact. And if the evidence reaches federal hands before his people get here, he stopped. Let it complete itself. It changes what he can accomplish by getting here, Ray said. Right. A confrontation that results in arrests with a completed federal upload is worse for Goss than letting it go tonight and working the political angle. Men like him have lawyers who can fight evidence. They can't fight evidence plus a federal assault charge. The upload hit 100%. The bar went green. Eleanor closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Is it there?" she asked. Ray checked the screen, checked his phone where a confirmation message from Mercer's secure line had just arrived. "It's there," he said. She looked at the drive still in the laptop's USB port. She reached over and took it out carefully, held it in her palm for a moment, the same way she had held it in the truck. Not like a weapon, not like a trophy, like something that had been waiting a long time to be delivered somewhere. "Thomas," she said very quietly. Not to Jake, not to Ray, just the name said plainly into the room. Nobody spoke. Then Mercer's voice came back through the phone. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have the files. My team is processing them now. I have 2 agents approximately 19 minutes from your location. They will take you to a secure facility tonight." A pause. "I want you to know that what you've delivered tonight, the scope of it, the documentation, this is not a small thing. This is years of work your husband completed under circumstances that I cannot begin to—" She stopped herself, the professionalism pulling itself back into place. He would have been an important witness. He was an important man, Eleanor said simply. Yes. Mercer's voice was quieter now. He was. Jake moved to the window. The vehicles on the highway hadn't moved. Danny's people were still out there in the dark, maintaining their position on the parallel road. 3 bikers in the rain, holding a watching brief over 3 parked SUVs while a federal upload completed. And a woman in a ranch building held a thumb drive that contained her husband's final 14 months of work. His phone buzzed. Danny again. This time just 4 words. They're leaving. Going west. Jake stared at those 4 words for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, "They're gone." Ray straightened. All three heading west. He thought about why. The upload was done, but they couldn't know that yet. Unless Mercer, he said toward the phone. Did your office send any communication in the last 5 minutes that might have flagged on a monitored channel? A pause. We sent a secure acknowledgement to your location. How secure? Another pause longer this time. Theoretically unmonitored, but if Goss has federal communications compromised to any degree, he'd know the upload completed, Jake said, and he'd know federal presence is inbound. Yes, which meant Goss had made his calculation the same one Jake had suspected, cut the lost retreat to defensible legal ground and fight it from there. It was a smart move for a man in his position. It was also, Jake understood with a cold clarity, not the end of anything. A man like Warren Goss did not simply absorb a blow like this and recalibrate quietly. He redirected. He regrouped. He used whatever time and access and influence he still had to complicate, to delay, to cast doubt. The evidence was in federal hands, but the fight it would take to turn that evidence into consequences, that fight was just beginning. He looked at Eleanor. She was watching him with the steady, knowing expression of a woman who had arrived at the same conclusion 3 seconds earlier. This isn't over, she said. It wasn't a question. No, Jake said. But it started. He paused. And starting was the part that almost didn't happen. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her expression, something he couldn't quite name, something in the neighborhood of gratitude, but older and quieter than that word usually carried. "It happened because you said yes," she said. Jake looked at the space where his coffee mug would have been if they were still in a diner on Route 89. He thought about the apple pie he hadn't finished. He thought about the specific way she'd stood behind him, trembling and steady at the same time, and whispered a thing that didn't make sense to anyone who didn't understand what fear plus courage actually looks like when they're in the same body at the same moment. "You walked toward me," he said, "in a room full of people who walked away. That's not nothing." She considered that. Thomas used to say that the direction you move in a frightening moment is the truest thing about you. Outside, somewhere on the access road, the first pair of federal headlights appeared, moving through the dark at a speed that said, "Arrival without urgency." The particular cadence of people who know the crisis has passed its sharpest point, but understand that careful still matters. Ray moved to the door. "That'll be Mercer's people," he said. Jake stayed where he was. Eleanor stayed where she was. Both of them looking at that first approaching light, and neither of them speaking because there was a quality to this moment that talking would ruin the specific exhausted, bone-deep relief of something that was supposed to have been stopped at every stage but hadn't been. A man who'd spent 8 months building a case, a woman who'd spent 14 months carrying it, and one night on a rain-soaked Arizona highway where something that was supposed to stay buried had finally irrevocably broken the surface. The federal agents knocked twice, and Ray opened the door. And Eleanor Mitchell, who had not cried once in the entire duration of this night, finally let her breath out in a way that was not quite crying either, but was the sound a person makes when they've been holding something enormous for longer than any person should have to. And the thing is finally, at last, in someone else's hands. The two federal agents were a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both carrying the specific economy of movement that comes from years of walking into rooms where something bad has already happened and something worse might still. The woman introduced herself as Agent Torres. The man said nothing, just took a position near the door and kept his eyes moving. Torres looked at Eleanor the way professionals look at people they've been briefed on with recognition, but without familiarity, which is its own kind of respect. "Mrs. Mitchell," Torres said. "Agent Mercer sends her regards." "Are you injured?" "I'm tired," Eleanor said. "Which is different." Torres almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am. We have a vehicle outside. We'd like to get you to the Phoenix office tonight if you're able." "I'm able." Eleanor stood from the table. She looked at Jake and then at Ray, and there was a moment brief without ceremony, the way the most important moments usually are, where she simply looked at both of them and let that be what it was. Then she looked back at Torres. "There's one thing before we go," she said. "Ma'am, my son Robert in Portland. His phone may be compromised. I need to reach him through a clean line and tell him I'm safe." Her voice stayed steady, but something underneath it pressed close to the surface. "He doesn't know what happened tonight. He'll have been awake for hours." Torres reached into her jacket and produced a phone. "Use this. It's clean." Eleanor took it with both hands, dialed without hesitating. It rang twice, and then a voice. A man's voice strained with the specific exhaustion of someone who has not slept and will not sleep until this call arrives. Said Mom. "I'm all right, Robert," she said. "I'm safe. I'm with federal agents." A pause. "I'm sorry you had to wait." A sound came through the phone that was not quite a word, more like the release of something that had been held for too long, under too much pressure. "Mom, I didn't know I called your phone and it went straight to, I know, I'll explain everything. Not tonight, but everything." She paused. "Are you all right?" A short, slightly broken laugh. "Am I all right, Mom?" "Robert, yes, I'm all right. Yes." His voice pulled itself back together. "Are you really safe?" "Truly, truly," she said, and the word carried the full weight of what it had cost to be able to say it. "Go to sleep. I'll call you in the morning." She handed the phone back to Torres. Her hands for the first time all night weren't perfectly still. There was a fine tremor in them that she didn't try to hide. Not the trembling of fear, but the trembling of something finally released, like a fist that has been clenched for so long that opening it takes conscious effort and the muscles shake from the memory of the holding. Jake watched her and said nothing. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said. It was not the performative gratitude of a person going through emotions. It was direct, simple, the way people speak when they mean something so completely that decoration would only reduce it. Jake looked at her. "You did the hard part," he said. 14 months of it. You did the part that made the rest possible. Don't minimize that." She paused. "You did the part that made the rest possible." He didn't argue with her. He'd learned over the course of about 4 hours in her company that arguing with Eleanor Mitchell on a matter she'd made her mind up about was an exercise with a predetermined outcome. Torres was moving them toward the door gently, professionally, the way agents move people when urgency exists, but panic doesn't serve it. Ray held the door. The night outside had gone quieter. The rain down to a presence rather than an assault, and the air had that particular quality of Arizona. After weather clean and cold and vast, like the sky has been emptied out and refilled with something new. At the door, Eleanor stopped. She turned and looked at Jake one more time. Something in her expression had changed. The operational focus that had carried her through the night was still there, but behind it now, something else was visible. Something older and less guarded. The face of a woman who has just survived something that she wasn't entirely sure she would survive and is allowing herself, for exactly one moment, to know it. "He would have wanted to thank you himself," she said. Jake understood immediately who she meant. He was quiet for a second. "He did the work," he said finally. "I just moved it down the road." Her eyes held his. "That's all any of us can do," she said. Then Torres guided her gently forward, and the door closed, and the sound of the federal vehicle's engine starting up carried through the night, and then faded east toward Phoenix, toward a field office where 14 months of a careful man's work was already loading onto secure servers and beginning the long, complicated, necessary process of becoming justice. Ray stood beside Jake in the doorway, both of them listening to the engine sound disappear. "She's going to be all right," Ray said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jake said. "She is." A pause. "Goss isn't done," Ray said. "No." Men like that, when they lose the first engagement, they regroup. They lawyer up. They start calling in favors from the people who owe them. They look for procedural angles, chain of custody challenges, anything they can use to attack the evidence. Ray's voice was flat and factual. The voice of a man who has watched this exact sequence play out before and carries a specific permanent anger about it that he's learned to speak about without showing. It could take years. "I know," Jake said. "You okay with that?" Jake thought about the question. He thought about Eleanor's hands on her coffee mug. He thought about the pressed-together lips and the perfect posture and the way she'd said Thomas's name in that ranch building, like dropping flowers on a grave that had been unmarked for too long. What Goss does next, Jake said, isn't my department. Getting her to the point where she could hand it over, that was my department. He paused. She got it there. That's what counts. Ray nodded slowly. Mercer's good, he said. If anyone can hold it together through a protracted legal fight, it's her. Jake didn't respond to that. He was thinking about something else. The thing he hadn't said out loud yet. The thing that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the moment on the highway when Danny's text arrived, telling him the vehicles had gone west. Goss hadn't sent someone to deliver a retreat. He'd sent someone to deliver a calculation. And men like Goss didn't make calculations that ended in walking away. They made calculations that ended in positioning. He'd withdrawn from tonight's particular field, but the calculation itself was ongoing, which meant Eleanor Mitchell would need that federal protection to hold and hold well for longer than one night. He pulled out his phone, texted Danny 3 words, "Stay in state." The reply came back in 11 seconds. Already planned on it. He put the phone away. Ray was watching him. "Your people staying around?" Ray asked. "Some of them." Jake looked at the dark road that led back to the gate. "She's going to be in Phoenix. We've got members in Phoenix." Ray said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's not something the club usually does. The club does what the situation calls for," Jake said. "This situation calls for it." Another pause. Then Ray said something he clearly hadn't planned to say, something that came up from a deeper place than his professional vocabulary usually reached. "You know what I thought when you first called me? Before I knew anything about what was happening tonight." He stopped, considered. "I thought Jake Hunter calling me at 11 p.m. from an unknown number means someone's in serious trouble. And then I thought whoever that someone is, they picked the right person to call." He paused. "I was right." Jake looked at him. "I didn't do anything you wouldn't have done." "Maybe, but I wasn't there." Ray moved back inside. "Coffee's on. You want some before you ride out?" Jake looked at his watch. 12:41 a.m. He thought about the highway ahead of him, the long, dark miles back toward wherever the chapter was gathering the cold air, and the wet road, and the particular sensation of forward motion that had always been for him the closest thing to processing that existed. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take some coffee." They sat at the card table for 20 minutes. 2 men who had known each other across the specific geography of favor and trust and shared history that exists between people who have been in serious situations together, drinking coffee and saying relatively little. Ray told him that Mercer had already initiated a formal request to bypass county law enforcement channels in all communications related to the Mitchell case, citing credible evidence of internal compromise. That had taken her approximately 40 minutes from the moment Eleanor said Warren Goss's name. Jake thought about that. 40 minutes for a federal agent who'd been awake past midnight to initiate a process that would take months to fully resolve, and felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them. He was almost done with his coffee when his phone buzzed again. Not Danny this time, a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it, let it ring twice, then picked up. Hunter. A woman's voice, controlled familiar from the earlier phone call. "This is Mercer." He put the mug down. "Agent Mercer, Mrs. Mitchell is en route. She's safe. I wanted you to know." A pause. "I also wanted to tell you something directly rather than through Ray." Another pause, shorter. The third set of documents, the ones Thomas sent to the attorney in Phoenix. Jake went still. "What about them?" "The attorney's name is Paul Henley. We've been trying to reach him since Mrs. Mitchell mentioned him tonight. We reached his office 40 minutes ago." A pause that had weight in it. Mr. Henley was in a car accident 2 weeks ago. He's been in a rehabilitation facility since then. The documents he received were stored in his office. When his staff went to retrieve them tonight at our request, she stopped. The office had been broken into sometime in the last 72 hours. The documents are gone. The ranch building kitchen was very quiet. Jake looked at the table, at his coffee mug, at the grain of the wooden surface that he'd been looking at without seeing for the last 20 minutes. He thought about what this meant in the sequence of what he knew. The drive was in federal hands. The uploaded files were on secure servers. Those were safe. But the third set, the physical copies Thomas had mailed, the ones Eleanor didn't know were already gone, had been intercepted, which meant Goss's operation had been moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, which meant the sophistication of it was even deeper than tonight had shown, which meant Thomas Mitchell had been right about all of it, and it had cost him everything. "The drive Eleanor carried is intact," Jake said. "The upload is complete." "Yes, that's what we have, and it's sufficient. I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you because you should understand the full scope of what you walked into tonight and what Mrs. Mitchell has been navigating alone." A pause. She never knew the attorney's copies were gone. She's been operating on the assumption that she had backup. She did have backup, Jake said. She just didn't know it was only her. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Yes, that's exactly right. He thought about 2 days of running borrowed phones and cash only, and 4 miles on foot to avoid a checkpoint she didn't trust. An 89-year-old woman who thought she had 2 other safety nets, and had in fact had none, carrying the only surviving copy of her husband's work in her left shoe. Not because she'd calculated that it was the last copy, but because Thomas had told her to keep it there. Because Thomas had believed in redundancy, and Eleanor had believed in Thomas, and the chain of faith between a dead man's instruction and a living woman's compliance had been the single thread keeping 14 months of evidence from disappearing entirely. "Is she going to be told?" Jake asked. "Yes, when she's settled, when she's rested." A pause. "It won't change what she did tonight, but she should know how close it was." "She already knows how close things were," Jake said. "She's known since the woman in Prescott died 3 weeks ago." Mercer said, "The woman in Prescott. I'm looking into that." "Good." A pause. "Mr. Hunter, I'm going to say something that is somewhat outside my professional vocabulary, so bear with me." A beat. "What you did tonight, making that call, getting her out, getting her to Ray, keeping the upload running, none of that was your responsibility. None of it was your job. You had every reason to finish your coffee and get back on the road." She stopped. A lot of people would have. Jake looked at his coffee mug for a moment. "She walked toward me," he said, "in a room where everyone else walked away. That's not something you just let be." Mercer was quiet on the other end then. "No, I suppose it isn't." A pause. "Get some rest, Mr. Hunter. And thank you." The line went dead. Ray was looking at him from across the table. He'd heard enough of one side of the conversation to read the shape of it. "Henley's copies are gone," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Ray absorbed that with the stillness of a man who has processed bad news often enough to have developed a methodology for it. He picked up his coffee, put it down. "She made it through anyway." "She made it through anyway," Jake said. He stood, picked up his helmet from the counter where he'd set it when they came in. Ray walked him to the door without being asked, because that was who Ray was, a man who completed things, who saw them to the threshold and no further, because beyond the threshold was someone else's road. At the door, Jake stopped. "The favor," he said. "Consider it settled." Ray looked at him. Something moved through his expression that was not sentiment and was not detachment, but occupied the honest ground between them. "The favor I owed you," Ray said carefully, "was for what you did for my nephew 3 years ago. That was a different thing." He paused. "Tonight, you came to me. Tonight, we're even on something new." Another pause. "Don't make it transactional. It doesn't suit either of us." Jake looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand out. Ray took it. They shook once firmly, the way men do when they mean something that neither of them is going to say. Then Jake walked out into the Arizona night. Danny was waiting on the access road alone, the other 2 bikes gone. He was sitting on his Harley with his arms crossed and his helmet on his tank. And when Jake came out, he didn't say anything. Just watched Jake get to his bike, check it over, put his helmet on. "She get out safe?" Danny asked. "She's in federal custody heading for Phoenix." "Good." Danny picked up his helmet. "Chapter staging in Prescott tonight. You coming?" Jake swung onto the bike, sat for a moment with his hands on the bars, feeling the familiar geometry of it. The weight, the balance, the particular sense of potential that a motorcycle gives you when the engine is off and the road is ahead, and all the things that happen behind you are for this moment exactly that, behind you. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." He started the engine. The sound of it rolled out across the quiet post-storm dark and bounced off nothing and disappeared into the enormous Arizona sky. And Danny started his bike a half-second later, and together they moved down the access road toward the gate that Jake had driven through 3 hours ago, carrying an 89-year-old woman and the evidence of a dead man's courage. He hit the gate, worked the combination, 4 zeros, same as it had always been, and pushed through onto the county road and then onto the highway. And then he opened the throttle and the night took him. He didn't think about Warren Goss, who was somewhere west of him in a county building or a home office or the back of a car making calls and building contingencies and doing what men who have spent their entire careers insulating themselves from consequence do when consequence finally, irrevocably arrives. That fight was going to be long and legal and ugly, and people with the right tools were handling it. He didn't think about Martin Hale, whose careful smile and county fleet sedan and staged vehicles had been the visible surface of something that went up further than anyone in that diner had known to look. Mercer would find the layers. That was what Mercer was for. He thought about Thomas Mitchell, who had been a county auditor for 31 years and who had found something he wasn't supposed to find, and who had spent 8 months verifying it with the patience of a man who believed that accuracy was a form of respect, and who had gone to the wrong person with the right information and died 6 weeks later with a heart attack. He'd never had a history of, and whose evidence had survived him because he had believed in redundancy, and his wife had believed in him. He thought about Eleanor in a federal vehicle heading toward Phoenix, who would arrive at an FBI field office and sit across from Diane Mercer and spend the next several hours going through everything one more time in complete accurate detail, because that was who she was and who Thomas had loved, and who had walked across a diner floor toward the most intimidating man in the room, because she had run out of safe choices and decided that safe was no longer the measure of things. She had walked toward him, and he had said yes. The highway was empty and long and dark, and the air coming off the desert after the storm was the cleanest thing Jake Hunter had breathed in years, and the engine beneath him carried its note steady and true. And somewhere behind him, a gate swung shut on a night that would not be forgotten by any person who had lived it. And somewhere ahead of him, the chapter was gathering in Prescott, and somewhere in Phoenix, a woman was telling the truth for the last time to the people who finally had the power to do something with it. None of them had planned any of this. Not the biker who wanted pie and coffee and to be back on the road by midnight. Not the retired marshal who still answered calls at 11 p.m. because some things don't stop with the badge. Not the FBI agent who picked up on the second ring. Not Danny Reyes who'd gotten a 4-word text and ridden out into a storm without a second question. None of them had been assigned to this night. They had simply been the people who were there, and who chose each in their own way across the span of a few hours on a rain-soaked Arizona highway to do the thing that the moment required. That is the truth about courage that no one tells you at the beginning. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for the right circumstances or the right person or the right equipment. It arrives in the middle of ordinary nights, in roadside diners and ranch buildings, on unmarked county roads, wearing the clothes it happened to have on, doing what it can with what's in front of it. Thomas Mitchell had known that. He'd known it for 31 years, and he'd proved it with 8 months of meticulous work, and he'd paid for it with his life. And on a night in Arizona, in a diner on Route 89, an 89-year-old woman had made sure it counted. The road opened up ahead of Jake, long and straight, and lit by nothing but his own headlight and the stars breaking through the last of the cloud cover above. And he rode into it without slowing because that was the only direction there was. Forward. Always forward. 6 months passed like water through a canyon, slow and inevitable, and wearing everything down to its essential shape. The legal machinery ground forward with the specific patience of systems built to outlast individual lives. Grand juries convened. Indictments were issued. Warren Goss was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home in Prescott Valley by federal agents who'd coordinated the timing specifically to avoid any county law enforcement presence. The news made it to the evening broadcasts within 3 hours, and by nightfall the story had metastasized into the kind of scandal that ends careers and redefines how people think about institutions they'd previously trusted. Senator David Williams resigned 11 days after Goss's arrest, citing health reasons that no one believed and everyone accepted, because the alternative was a trial that would have taken down 6 other officials with him. The resignation was the trade. Mercer had been right about that. Men like Goss didn't go down alone when the walls came in. They took deals. They gave names. They traded their way to smaller cells and shorter sentences. The third name on Thomas Mitchell's list, the developer Marcus Webb, fought. He had the money for it, the kind of legal team that could turn a straightforward corruption case into a 3-year marathon of motions and appeals and procedural challenges. But the evidence Thomas had compiled was too thorough, too specific, too methodically documented to be buried under lawyering. Webb's trial was set for the following spring. Eleanor Mitchell testified before a grand jury in late September. Jake heard about it through Ray, who heard about it through Mercer, who called him specifically to tell him that Eleanor had walked into that room with the same steady composure she'd carried through everything else, had answered every question with precision, and had walked out 2 hours later, having given testimony that the prosecutors described as airtight. Jake didn't see Eleanor during those 6 months. Didn't call. Didn't reach out. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he understood that what she was living through now was different from what she'd lived through that night. That night had been about survival. The 6 months that followed were about something harder, about sitting in rooms with lawyers and agents and prosecutors and telling the same story over and over until it stopped feeling like her story and started feeling like evidence. About living in a safe house in Phoenix with federal protection outside her door and knowing that the life she'd built over 89 years was gone, not because she'd lost it, but because she'd chosen to trade it for something more important. He understood that because he'd made similar trades, smaller ones maybe, less dramatic, but trades nonetheless. The badge for principle, the marriage for conscience, his daughter for the belief that some things mattered more than personal happiness. He didn't know if he'd been right about those trades, but he knew Eleanor had been right about hers, and that was enough. The Hells Angels maintained a presence in Phoenix through those 6 months. Not official, not coordinated with law enforcement, just members who happened to live in the area making sure they rode past the safe house a few times a week, making sure federal protection saw them, making sure anyone else who might be watching understood that Eleanor Mitchell had people who cared whether she made it to trial. Danny coordinated it without being asked, the way he coordinated everything with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that some debts couldn't be repaid, only honored. In late October, Agent Mercer called Jake directly. It was the first time they'd spoken since that night. "Mr. Hunter," she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who'd been working 18-hour days for 6 months and was only just beginning to see the outline of an ending. "I wanted to give you an update. I'm listening." Warren Goss accepted a plea agreement this morning. 22 years federal facility, no parole. In exchange, he's providing testimony against 6 additional individuals, including a state attorney general and 2 sitting county commissioners. Jake absorbed that. 22 years. For a man Goss's age, that was effectively life. "What about Eleanor?" he asked. "She'll still need to testify at Webb's trial, but the bulk of her involvement is complete. We're working on transitioning her out of protective custody. She's asked about returning to Scottsdale. Is that safe?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. Safer than it was 6 months ago. Goss was the center of gravity. With him removed and cooperating, the organizational structure has collapsed. There are still people who'd prefer Mrs. Mitchell didn't testify against Webb, but they're scattered now, disorganized. She paused. "We'll maintain periodic check-ins, but full-time protection won't be necessary much longer." "That's good." Another pause. "Mr. Hunter, there's something else. Mrs. Mitchell has asked about you several times. She wanted to know if you were all right, if the club faced any repercussions for helping her." "We're fine," Jake said. "I told her as much." Mercer's voice softened slightly. "She wanted me to thank you. She said she tried to find a way to reach you directly, but didn't want to intrude." Jake looked out the window of the chapter house where he was standing at the Arizona sun, cutting hard shadows across the parking lot. "Tell her she's not an intrusion." "I will." A pause. "You should know what she did, what you helped her do. It's going to change things. Not overnight, not dramatically, but the systems that allowed Goss to operate the relationships, the blind spots, those are being examined now in ways they weren't before. That matters." Thomas did the work Jake said. Eleanor made sure it counted. "I just moved it down the road." Mercer made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "That's not how she describes it. But I suspect arguing with you about that would be a waste of both our time." "Probably. Take care, Mr. Hunter. You too." The call ended, and Jake stood there for a moment, phone in hand, thinking about Eleanor in a safe house in Phoenix, asking about him, wanting to know if he was all right, and feeling something shift in his chest. The same thing that had shifted that night when she'd walked toward him. The recognition of something rare. Not courage exactly, though there was courage in it, but something older than courage. The specific quality of a person who believed that other people mattered and acted on that belief even when it cost them everything. He put the phone away and went back to whatever he'd been doing before the call, which was fixing a carburetor on Cruz's bike, And the work settled him the way work always did, and the day moved forward. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in November, Jake was working on his own bike in the driveway of the small house he rented on the edge of Prescott when a car pulled up. Blue sedan, not new, but well-maintained, driven by a woman he recognized immediately, even though she looked different than she had that night. Eleanor Mitchell stepped out of the car, moving carefully, but without assistance. She wore slacks and a cardigan, her white hair pulled back the same way, but something in her bearing had changed. Not diminished exactly, but settled, like a structure that had been under enormous pressure and had finally been allowed to rest under its own weight. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jake said, straightening up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mr. Hunter." She came toward him, slowly taking in the house, the bike, the quiet street. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." She reached him and stopped, looked at him with those same sharp, steady eyes. "I wanted to thank you in person. The words I said to Agent Mercer didn't feel sufficient." "You don't need to thank me. I do." She paused. "You gave me something I'd lost. The belief that there are still people who help without needing a reason beyond the fact that help is needed." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been good with gratitude, especially when it felt bigger than what he'd actually done. "How are you?" he asked instead. "Tired," she said simply. "But all right." The safe house was. She smiled slightly, not designed for comfort. "But I'm back in Scottsdale now, back in my own home. It feels strange. Strange how..." "Like visiting a place I used to live rather than living there." She looked at the bike he'd been working on. "Thomas had a motorcycle when we were young. I told you that, didn't I?" "You did. He was terrible at it." She smiled more fully now, and the expression transformed her face. "Dropped years off it. He laid it down twice in the first month. But he loved it. Said it made him feel free." Jake thought about that. About Thomas Mitchell, county auditor, methodical and careful and precise, getting on a motorcycle and feeling free. About the particular paradox of a man who spent his professional life inside systems, choosing to spend his personal life on something that had no room for anything except the road and the wind and the choice you made in each moment. "He sounds like he was a good man," Jake said. He was. Eleanor's eyes had gone distant for a moment, the way eyes do when people are looking at something that isn't there anymore but used to be. "The best man I ever knew." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "There's something I wanted to ask you." "All right." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photograph, black and white, edges worn. It showed a man in his 30s, dark hair, strong jaw, standing next to a motorcycle in what looked like the 1970s. He was smiling, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine happiness. "That's Thomas," Eleanor said, "the year we got married." She looked at the photo for a moment. "I have very few pictures of him this happy. He was always serious, always thinking. But on that bike," she tapped the photo gently, "he was different." She held the photo out to Jake. "I want you to have this." Jake looked at her. "Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor, please. After everything, I think you've earned the right to call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," he said, "I can't take this." "You can." She pressed it into his hand. "Because you understood something about tonight that I didn't fully see until later. You understood that Thomas wasn't just trying to expose corruption. He was trying to prove that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary power and win." She paused. "You proved that too, in your own way. And I think Thomas would have wanted you to know that someone remembered, that someone cared enough to finish what he started." Jake looked at the photograph. At Thomas Mitchell, 30 years old, standing next to a motorcycle, he was terrible at riding, smiling like he'd found something worth the risk. He took the photo. "Thank you," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. Then she reached into her purse again and pulled out a small card. "This is my number. If you're ever in Scottsdale or if you just want to talk, please call." She paused. "I don't have many people left who understand what those months were like, what that night was like. It would be nice to talk to someone who was there." Jake took the card. "I will." She smiled. "Good." She turned to go, then stopped, looked back. "One more thing. My granddaughter Sarah. She's coming to stay with me for Thanksgiving. She wanted to meet you." She said. Eleanor's expression softened. She said she wanted to meet the man who helped her grandmother when no one else would. Jake felt something catch in his throat. "I'd like that." "Good," Eleanor said again. "Then I'll call you." She walked back to her car, got in, and drove away. And Jake stood in his driveway holding a photograph of a man he'd never met and a phone number written in careful, precise handwriting, and felt the specific weight of being trusted with something that mattered. Thanksgiving came cold and clear. Jake rode to Scottsdale on a Thursday morning, the highway empty of everyone except the people who didn't have anywhere to be or were heading somewhere they actually wanted to go. The ride took 2 hours, and he spent most of it thinking about nothing, which was the point of riding. To empty out. To let the engine and the road do the thinking. Eleanor's house was in a quiet neighborhood, modest but well-kept, the kind of place where people stayed for 30 years and knew their neighbors' names. She answered the door wearing an apron and the same steady expression she'd worn through everything else. "Mr. Hunter," she said, then caught herself. "Jake, Eleanor, come in, please." He stepped inside. The house smelled like turkey and something sweet he couldn't place. Pie, probably. The living room was furnished simply, everything clean, and ordered photographs on the walls of people Jake assumed were family. Thomas appeared in several of them, older versions of the man in the photograph Eleanor had given him, always with the same serious expression, always standing slightly to the side like he was more comfortable observing than being observed. "Sarah's in the kitchen," Eleanor said. "She's been nervous about meeting you all morning. She doesn't need to be nervous. I told her that." Eleanor smiled. She didn't believe me. They walked through to the kitchen. Sarah was standing at the counter, 17 years old. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like it might have belonged to her grandmother. She looked up when they entered, and her eyes went wide. "You're Jake," she said, "and you're Sarah." She came around the counter, stopped a few feet away, clearly wanting to say something but not sure how to start. Finally, she just said, "Thank you for helping my grandmother." For she stopped, looked at Eleanor, for making sure she was okay. "Your grandmother did the hard part," Jake said. "I just helped her get where she needed to go." "That's not how she tells it," Sarah said. "She told me you stood between her and some really bad people and didn't even know her." Jake looked at Eleanor. She was watching them both with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite pride, not quite relief, something that lived in the space between. "Your grandmother walked into a diner and asked a stranger for help," Jake said. "That takes more courage than anything I did." Sarah considered that. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Were you scared that night?" Jake thought about it. About Hale walking in with his practiced smile, about the 2 men by the door, about the 3 vehicles in the parking lot, about the moment when he'd had to decide whether to walk away or stay. "Yeah," he said. "I was scared." "But you stayed anyway." "Yeah." Sarah nodded like he'd confirmed something she'd needed to hear. Grandma said you would say that. She said the people who say they're not scared are usually lying. Your grandmother's right about most things, Jake said. They had dinner at a table Eleanor had set with care, the kind of care that comes from a lifetime of hosting meals and understanding that the ritual of it matters as much as the food. Turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes and green beans and rolls that Sarah had made herself, slightly lopsided but edible. Eleanor said grace, a short, simple prayer that thanked God for safety and family and the people who show up when they're needed, and Jake, who hadn't prayed in 15 years, found himself meaning the amen. They ate and talked about small things. Sarah's school, Eleanor's plans to volunteer at the library again once Webb's trial concluded, Jake's work at the chapter house. Nobody mentioned Thomas directly, but he was there in the way he's always there for people who loved him, present in absence, the ghost, at every table where his chair sits empty. After dinner, while Eleanor and Sarah cleaned up, Jake walked outside. The night was cold and clear, stars thick overhead, the way they only get in the desert when you're far enough from city lights. He stood in the driveway looking up and thinking about everything that had happened in the 6 months since that night on Route 89. About the trades people make, about the cost of doing the right thing, about whether any of it actually mattered in the long run or if it was just people making themselves feel better by pretending their choices had weight. He didn't have an answer for that. He suspected no one did. The door opened behind him. Sarah came out wrapped in a jacket that was too big for her. "Grandma's making coffee," she said. "She wanted to know if you take cream or sugar. Black's fine." She nodded but didn't go back inside, just stood there looking at the same stars he'd been looking at. After a moment, she said, "I was scared they were going to hurt her. When I found out what was happening, when the police came to my school and told me I had to go with them because someone had threatened me." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe my dad was hurt or something. And then they told me it was about Grandma, and She stopped. "You thought you were going to lose her?" Jake said. "Yeah, but you didn't." "No." She looked at him. "Because of you, and your friends, and the FBI lady, and Mr. Calder." She paused. "Grandma said there were a lot of people who helped." "There were." "Why?" Sarah asked. The question wasn't challenging. It was genuine. "Why did all of you help someone you didn't even know?" Jake thought about how to answer that. About how to explain to a 17-year-old girl that sometimes the only thing that makes sense in a senseless world is helping when you're asked, even when it costs you something, especially when it does. Because he said, "Finally, your grandmother asked." And when someone asks like that when they've run out of every other option, and they're asking because asking is the last thing they have left, you don't say no. Not if you're the kind of person who can live with yourself afterward. Sarah absorbed that. Then she said, "I want to be like that. Like her. Like you. Someone who doesn't walk away." "Then you will be," Jake said. She nodded, stood there a moment longer, then said coffee's probably ready and went back inside. Jake followed a minute later. Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table, 3 mugs poured steam rising in the overhead light. She gestured to a chair, and he sat. They drank coffee and talked about nothing important, and everything that mattered the way people do when they've been through something together and don't need to explain it because the shared experience lives in the spaces between words. At some point, Eleanor said, "I'm testifying at Webb's trial in March. Would you come not to testify, just to be there?" Jake looked at her. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She set her mug down. I'd like to know that when I walk into that courtroom, someone who was there that night is sitting in the gallery. Someone who knows that what I'm saying isn't just words. That it's," she paused, searching for the right language, "that it's the thing Thomas died for, and the thing we all fought to protect." "I'll be there," Jake said. Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." Sarah was watching both of them with an expression that was hard to read. Then she said, "I want to come too. To the trial." Eleanor looked at her. "Sarah, I want to see it," Sarah said. "I want to see the people who threatened me have to sit there and listen to you tell the truth. I want to see what it looks like when the bad guys lose." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "All right, we'll go together." March came with the particular softness of an Arizona spring, when the desert blooms for 3 weeks and then burns off into summer. The trial of Marcus Webb began on a Tuesday in a federal courthouse in Phoenix. Media packed into the gallery, cameras outside because cameras weren't allowed inside. Jake rode up the morning the trial started, found a place to park, and walked into the courthouse in jeans and a button-down shirt. No vest, no patches, nothing that would draw attention. He wasn't here as a Hell's Angel. He was here as a man who'd made a promise. Eleanor was already inside, sitting in a witness waiting room with Sarah beside her. She stood when he entered, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she crossed the room and hugged him. Brief, firm, the embrace of someone who'd learned that some things couldn't be said and had to be felt instead. "Thank you for coming," she said when she stepped back. "Wouldn't miss it." The trial lasted 4 weeks. Jake couldn't attend every day. He had work, had obligations to the club, but he came when he could. Sat in the gallery and watched Eleanor take the stand 3 separate times. Watched her walk the jury through Thomas's documentation with the same precision and care Thomas had used to create it. Watched defense attorneys try to shake her and fail, because you can't shake someone whose testimony is built on truth and 31 years of meticulous professional practice. On the final day after closing arguments, after the jury had been sent to deliberate, Jake found Eleanor and Sarah outside the courthouse. Eleanor looked exhausted, not physically, but in the deeper way that comes from reliving trauma in a public forum for weeks on end. "How are you holding up?" Jake asked. "I'm here," Eleanor said. "That's enough." They waited together in a small park across from the courthouse, not talking much, just existing in the shared space of people who'd been through something and were waiting to see if it had been worth it. After 2 hours, Eleanor's phone rang, her attorney telling her the jury had reached a verdict. They walked back into the courthouse, took their seats, watched Marcus Webb, who'd spent $14 million other people's money and thought he could lawyer his way out of consequences, stand as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Eleanor's hand found Sarah's. Sarah's found Jake's. And they sat there, the 3 of them connected by the particular bond of people who'd fought for something and won, not because winning was guaranteed, but because losing had never been an option. Outside, after it was over, after the media had gotten their statements, and the prosecutors had shaken Eleanor's hand and promised to stay in touch, Eleanor turned to Jake. "It's finished," she said. "Not quite," Jake said. "There's still the sentencing, still appeals." "No," Eleanor said. She looked at the courthouse, at the place where she'd spent 4 weeks telling the truth about her husband's death. "It's finished. The rest is just," she gestured vaguely, "machinery, legal process. But the part that mattered, the part where we proved that Thomas was right and they were wrong, that's finished." Jake looked at this woman who'd been running for 2 days when he met her. who'd been carrying the weight of her husband's final work for 14 months, who'd just spent 4 weeks reliving the worst period of her life in front of strangers, and who stood here now saying it was finished with the calm finality of someone who'd reached the end of something and was ready to set it down. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "All of us." Sarah was standing a little ways off, talking to someone on her phone, probably her father in Portland, telling him it was over, telling him they'd won. Eleanor watched her granddaughter for a moment. Then she said to Jake, "She wants to study criminal justice. Did she tell you that?" "No, she does. Says she wants to be like Agent Mercer, someone who holds people accountable." Eleanor's voice had something in it that might have been pride and might have been worry and was probably both. "I told her it's hard work, told her it costs you things. She said she knows, said she learned that from watching what happened to Thomas, to me." She paused. "To you. I didn't do anything worth modeling a life after," Jake said. Eleanor looked at him with those sharp, steady eyes. "You stood between a frightened old woman and people who wanted to hurt her. You called your friends in the middle of the night and they came without question. You helped me get to people who could do something with the evidence my husband died collecting." She paused. "If that's not worth modeling a life after, I don't know what is." Jake didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure there was one. Sarah came back over phone away, smiling in a way she probably hadn't smiled in months. "Dad says congratulations," she said. "He wants to know if we're celebrating." "I think we are," Eleanor said. She looked at Jake. "Join us for dinner. I should probably get back on the road." "One dinner," Eleanor said. "Please. It would mean a lot." Jake looked at both of them. At this family that had been through hell and come out the other side. At these two women who'd asked him to be part of something important and were asking him now to be part of something simple. "All right," he said. "One dinner." They went to a quiet restaurant on the edge of Phoenix, the kind of place where the food was good and the lighting was low and no one bothered you if you wanted to sit for hours. They ordered too much food and ate slowly and talked about everything except the trial. Sarah told stories about school. Eleanor talked about her plans to travel, something she and Thomas had always meant to do and never gotten around to. Jake found himself talking about things he hadn't talked about in years. His daughter, Emily, the badge he'd lost, and whether he'd ever really wanted it back. At some point, Sarah excused herself to the restroom, and Jake and Eleanor sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "She's going to be all right," Jake said. "I know," Eleanor said. "She's stronger than I was at her age, stronger than I am now, probably." "I doubt that." Eleanor smiled. "You're kind to say so." She paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. That night in the diner when I asked for your help, did you have any idea what you were saying yes to?" Jake thought about it. About the moment when Eleanor had walked up to him trembling and steady at the same time and asked him to pretend to be her grandson. About everything that had followed. "No," he said. "I had no idea." "Would you have still said yes if you did?" Jake looked at her. At this woman who had lost her husband to corruption and her sense of safety to fear and 14 months of her life to the fight for justice, who'd walked into a diner and chosen him out of everyone there because she'd seen something in him that he'd forgotten was there. "Yeah," he said. "I would have." Eleanor nodded, reached across the table and put her hand on his. Just rested it there for a moment the way she had that first night in the diner. "I'm glad," she said. Sarah came back and they finished dinner and walked out into the Arizona night. The air was cool and clean and the sky was full of stars, and Jake stood in the parking lot and thought about how strange it was that the most important moments in a person's life often looked like ordinary ones. A meal at a restaurant, a conversation at a table, the choice to say yes when someone asked for help. Eleanor and Sarah drove back to Scottsdale. Jake got on his bike and headed toward Prescott. The highway was empty and the ride was long, and he spent most of it thinking about Thomas Mitchell, who'd spent 8 months documenting corruption and died before he could see it exposed. About Eleanor, who'd spent 14 months making sure his death counted for something. About the strange mathematics of justice, where one person's courage could multiply through others until it became something bigger than any individual contribution. He thought about his own life, about the trades he'd made, about Emily and his daughter and the badge and whether any of it had been worth it. He still didn't have a complete answer to that. But he had part of one now, and part was better than nothing. The chapter house was quiet when he arrived. Danny was in the garage working on a carburetor, looked up when Jake walked in. How'd it go? Guilty on all counts. Danny nodded. Good. He went back to the carburetor, then without looking up said, "You did a good thing, brother." "We all did," Jake said. "Yeah," Danny said. "But you started it." Jake didn't argue, just went to his bike and started working on the tune-up he'd been putting off for weeks, and the work settled him the way it always did. And the night moved forward, and somewhere in Scottsdale, an 89-year-old woman was going to sleep in her own bed for the first time in months without federal agents outside her door. And somewhere in the machinery of the justice system, men who'd thought themselves untouchable were facing the consequences of their choices. And somewhere in the desert, the rain that had fallen 6 months ago had soaked into the earth and fed the spring blooms that would burn off in 3 weeks, but were beautiful now in this moment, which was all they'd ever needed to be. Jake Hunter worked on his bike and thought about nothing and everything, and when he finally went to bed, he slept without dreaming, which was the first time in 15 years that had happened. And in the morning when he woke up, he called his daughter. It rang 4 times. He almost hung up, then her voice cautious, surprised. "Dad." "Hey, Katie." A pause. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay. I just..." He stopped, started again. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Another pause, then softer. "Oh." They talked for 20 minutes, small things. Her job, her life, the weather, nothing important and everything that mattered. And when they hung up, Katie said, "Call me again sometime, okay?" And Jake said he would, and he did, because some things were worth fighting for. And some things were worth coming back to. And Jake Hunter, who'd spent 15 years believing he'd lost everything that mattered, was starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, some things could be rebuilt. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Eleanor Mitchell had taught him something in the span of 1 night and 6 months of aftermath. She'd taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it, and that sometimes the most unlikely people became family, and that doing the right thing even when it cost you everything was still worth doing, because in the end, that was all any of them had. The choices they made, the people they helped, the stands they took when it would have been easier to look away. Thomas Mitchell had understood that, had proved it with 8 months of work and a death that should have silenced him but didn't. Eleanor Mitchell had understood it, had proved it by finishing what he started. And Jake Hunter, who'd lost his badge and his marriage and 15 years with his daughter because he tried to do the right thing and failed, was starting to understand it too. The right thing didn't always win, but sometimes it did, and sometimes was enough to keep trying. He went back to work, back to the club, back to the life he'd built in the spaces where his old life used to be. But something had changed. Some weight he'd been carrying had lifted. Not completely, not entirely, but enough that he could breathe a little easier. Enough that when people asked for help, he said yes without hesitation. Enough that when his phone rang and it was Katie, he answered. And on a Saturday in late April, almost exactly 1 year after that night on Route 89, Eleanor Mitchell called him. "Jake," she said, "I'm having a small gathering, just a few people. Sarah, Agent Mercer Ray Calder, some folks from the library." She paused. "I'd like you to come, if you're free." "What's the occasion?" "Thomas's birthday. He would have been 73. I usually spend it alone, but this year," she stopped. "This year I want to spend it with the people who made sure his work mattered." "When next Saturday?" 3 o'clock. "I'll be there," Jake said. "Good," Eleanor said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like relief, like she'd been worried he'd say no, like his presence mattered to her in a way that went beyond gratitude. They hung up, and Jake marked his calendar, and when Saturday came, he rode to Scottsdale in the early afternoon, the desert blooming around him for the second time in a year, the air warm and the sky impossibly blue. Eleanor's house was full when he arrived, people in the living room and the kitchen and spilling out into the backyard. Agent Mercer was there out of uniform talking to Ray about something that made both of them laugh. Sarah was showing someone pictures on her phone, probably college brochures. A few older women Jake didn't recognize were setting out food, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been friends with Eleanor for decades and knew where everything was kept. Eleanor saw him come in and cross the room, took his hands in both of hers. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thanks for inviting me." She led him through the house, introducing him to people whose names he'd forget in 5 minutes, but whose warmth he'd remember longer. These were Eleanor's people, her community, the network of support that had held her up through everything except the one thing that mattered most, which was the thing Jake and the others had provided. They ended up in the backyard, a small gathering around a table where Eleanor had set out a cake and photographs. Pictures of Thomas through the years, young and old, serious and smiling, always slightly to the side of the frame, always observing, always present. Eleanor stood in front of the table, and the conversations quieted. "Thank you all for coming," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, the voice of a woman who'd spent a year learning how to speak about painful things in public forums. Today would have been Thomas's 73rd birthday, and I wanted to mark it with the people who she paused gathering herself, who made sure that his last year of work wasn't wasted, who made sure that the truth he died trying to expose actually saw the light of day. She looked around the backyard, at Mercer, at Ray, at Jake, at Sarah, who was crying quietly in the way teenage girls cry when they're trying not to. Thomas believed that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary corruption and win. Eleanor continued. He believed it even when the evidence suggested otherwise, even when it cost him his life. And because of all of you, she gestured to encompass everyone there. He was right. Ordinary people did stand, and they did win. She picked up a photograph from the table, the same one she'd given Jake. Thomas on his motorcycle, young and smiling and free. "This is how I want to remember him," she said. "Not as a victim, not as someone who died for nothing, but as someone who lived believing that truth mattered, and who was proved right in the end. She set the photograph back down, cut the cake, and the gathering shifted into the easy rhythms of people sharing food and stories, and for the next few hours Thomas Mitchell was alive again in the memories of people who'd loved him. Jake found himself standing next to Agent Mercer at some point, both of them holding plates of cake they weren't really eating. "How's she doing?" Mercer asked. "Really? Better than I expected," Jake said. "Better than I would be." "She's remarkable," Mercer said. "We've had witnesses who fell apart under a tenth of the pressure she endured." She paused. "The Bureau's putting together a commendation for her. For Thomas, too, posthumously. It won't bring him back, but it's something." "It matters," Jake said. Mercer nodded, looked at him. "You know we could use people like you. People who understand that sometimes the system needs help from the outside to work the way it's supposed to." "I'm not looking for a job," Jake said. "Not a job," Mercer said. "Just if you see something, if someone comes to you the way Mrs. Mitchell did, you have my number." "I do." "Good." She paused. "What you did that night most people wouldn't have. You should know that." "Most people aren't in a position to," Jake said. "I was. That's all." Mercer smiled slightly. "I don't think that's all, but I'll let you believe it." She walked away, and Jake stood there for a moment holding his plate of cake, watching Eleanor move through her guests with the grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime making other people feel welcome. She caught his eye at one point, smiled, and he smiled back. And in that moment, in that backyard in Scottsdale on a warm April afternoon, Jake Hunter understood something he'd been reaching for since that night on Route 89. The trades he'd made, the badge and the marriage and the 15 years with his daughter, maybe they hadn't been mistakes. Maybe they'd just been the cost of being someone who couldn't walk away when walking away was the easier choice. And maybe that cost had brought him to exactly where he needed to be, to a diner on a rainy night, to a woman who needed help, to a moment where saying yes changed everything. He didn't know if that made the cost worth it, but he knew it made the cost mean something, and meaning was more than he'd had in a long time. Sarah came over, handed him a fresh piece of cake even though he hadn't finished the first one. "Grandma wanted me to make sure you were eating," she said. "I'm eating. She says you look too thin." Jake almost laughed. "I'm fine." Sarah grinned. "That's what I told her." She didn't believe me. They stood together for a moment, watching Eleanor talk to Ray about something that involved a lot of hand gestures. "She's happy," Sarah said. "Like really happy. I haven't seen her like this since Grandpa died." "That's good." "Yeah." Sarah paused. "She talks about you sometimes. About that night. She says you saved her life." "I helped," Jake said. "A lot of people helped." "That's what she says too," Sarah said. "But she says you were the first one, the one who said yes when she didn't have anyone else." Jake didn't know what to say to that. "I just wanted you to know," Sarah continued, "that it meant something. What you did, it still means something." She walked away before he could respond, and Jake stood there holding 2 pieces of cake and feeling something that might have been pride and might have been humility, and was probably both. The afternoon wore on. People started leaving. Mercer first citing an early morning meeting, then Ray shaking Jake's hand and saying something about staying in touch that they both knew probably wouldn't happen, but felt good to say anyway. The older women from the library, a few neighbors, until it was just Jake and Eleanor and Sarah cleaning up in the kitchen, moving in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. When the dishes were done and the leftover cake was wrapped and put away, Eleanor walked Jake to the door. "Thank you again," she said, "for coming, for everything." Anytime, Jake said, and meant it. She hugged him again, and when she stepped back, there were tears in her eyes. Thomas would have liked you, she said. I know I've said that before, but it's true. He would have seen in you what I saw. Someone who doesn't give up when things get hard. I gave up plenty of things, Jake said. But not on the things that mattered, Eleanor said. That's the difference. She stepped back, let him go, and Jake walked out into the Arizona evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red, and the air was cool and clean and full of the promise of spring. He got on his bike and started the engine and sat there for a moment looking back at the house. Eleanor and Sarah were visible through the window, moving through the kitchen, putting the last few things away. A family. Smaller than it used to be, marked by loss, but still there. Still moving forward. Jake put the bike in gear and pulled away, heading back toward Prescott, toward the chapter house, toward the life he'd built in the aftermath of the life he'd lost. And as he rode through the desert with the sunset at his back and the night ahead of him, he thought about courage and sacrifice and the strange mathematics of meaning. Thomas Mitchell had died trying to expose corruption. Eleanor Mitchell had spent 14 months making sure his death counted for something, and Jake Hunter had said yes to a stranger in a diner and found in the process something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Not redemption exactly, but something like it. The understanding that the choices he'd made, the trades he'd accepted, the costs he'd paid, they'd all led him to exactly where he needed to be, in exactly the moment someone needed him there. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it was more than enough. The road stretched out ahead of him, empty and dark and full of possibility. And Jake Hunter, 43 years old, former cop, current Hell's Angel, sometime hero to people who needed one, opened the throttle and rode into it without looking back. Because that was the only direction that mattered. Forward. Always forward.